Well, hey everybody, thank you for checking in once again and welcome to another episode. And today we're going to look at how I learned photography in the late 1970s. I've come out today to shoot this lovely old camera, the old Leica 3 from 1936, and it's kind of like I've come full circle. It's quite curious because this is a very similar camera to that on which I first learned photography all those years ago. That was on a Fed 4 back in the late 70s. So come with me back on a little trip through time and check out how I learned photography all those years ago. So the late 70s, well, let's think what was going on around that time. Well, it was before computers had come on the scene. Every piece of tech was still analog. We were all still driving around in what would now be considered very old cars, and there was also quite a bit of industrial unrest and strife going on at that time. But while the politicians were working all that out, I was learning photography, and I learned it on my old Fed 4. And the Fed 4 seemed like a magnificent thing to me. It was full of chrome and it had a nice sort of faux leather covering on the body, and it had lots of dials and it had interchangeable lenses, and it really did seem like a magnificent thing. I began by doing fairly simple shots, just sort of family shots, shots of people standing in places, usually in a group. So very, very simple sort of images. I was encouraged not to waste film at the time, so these images that I made were fairly infrequent to begin with, and as I say, they were usually very simple shots of, you know, maybe we'd go out for a drive in the car somewhere, and I'd take a shot of the family standing in a particular location, and that was fine for a time. As I learned to use the camera and to measure light and to use the rangefinder properly and so forth, but I knew there would be more to photography. I knew there was more that I wanted to do, but I didn't quite know what it was. I hadn't really studied photography in any way. That is, I hadn't looked at any of the work by major photographers, so I wasn't sort of visually informed in that way, so I really had to find my own way. But I had read several books about the actual process of making images, the technical process, things to do with exposure and aperture and depth of field and so on. And within those books were some fairly interesting images that did inform to some extent my visual understanding. I wanted to do more than traditional family shots, and I became interested in images of people, just candid images of people. I became interested in details, small details of things, and I was also interested in images of decay, things decaying and rotting and wearing out. I don't know where I got these ideas from, but I was very interested in these things. However, the Fed proved to be a little bit limiting in that respect. It was okay for street images, for images of people, although I didn't really have the courage to just take images of strangers on the street in those days. But it wasn't very good for getting close. You couldn't get closer than 3 feet with this camera. And it was fairly restricted in other ways as well. So it wasn't really an easy camera to use for getting the kind of shots that I was becoming interested in. What the Fed did do though, and where it was really, really useful, was giving me a very solid grounding in the technical aspects of photography. So measuring light, how to measure light, how to enter the settings onto the camera, how to adjust aperture to find the best depth of field. And I've got to admit, even in those days, I did like to shoot wide open, and I tried to keep that aperture open as much as I could. With film, it was a little difficult because I did like to use 400 film in those days, and 400 is a little bit fast, and sometimes it meant that I had to stop down. I didn't really want to do that, but I had to do it. But I did like to shoot wide open, pretty much right from the start, to try and get that blur in the background. And the Fed gave me a really solid grounding in all those technical aspects of photography that I needed to know. And that stayed with me for many, many years. And, you know, right up until the present day, what I learned on that old Fed camera has stayed with me right to this day. And, you know, it was a very, very good grounding in the technical aspects of photography and how you use a camera technically. Aesthetically, however, it was a very different question. I used the Fed for quite some time, and it did serve me well, and I used it probably right up until, gosh, the late 90s, I think, the early 2000s. I had a sort of a photographic hiatus for a few years where I didn't do a great deal of photography, and the Fed was sufficient for what I did. But by the late 90s, early 2000s, I was thinking about an SLR. Now, of course, I'd known about the existence of SLRs for many, many years, and I would have given anything for one when I was learning photography all those years ago. However, in the late 90s, I actually bought one. It was a fairly simple SLR. It was a Practica MTL. Importantly, it had a lens on it that would focus down to about 30 centimeters. It may have been a Carl Zeiss Jena lens, may have been a Pankolar lens, I'm not sure. It opened up to f1.8, and if it was a Pankolar, well, I didn't realize at the time what a wonderful lens it was. It may equally have been a Practica lens, the Practica 50mm f1.8, but whichever one it was, it allowed me to get close to the subject, and that really freed me up. That really gave me some wings, as it were, and I began making images in close-up, images of small things, images of details. And that was also the time when I started shooting, rather tentatively, my first images of people on the street, just candid shots of people on the street. Now, I'd like to say that was a fantastic camera that served me well for many years, and it was indeed a fantastic camera. It really allowed me to open up and to find where I was going, but it didn't serve me well for many years. It served me well just for a few months, because sadly it was left on a hillside in Castleton by Mrs. Z, who I had asked to look after it, and it was just one of those things. These things happen, and it was, I suppose, easily done. And it hadn't cost me a great deal of money. Actually, it only cost me £5, so it wasn't a great loss, but I did like the camera. However, that led me onto the hunt for another SLR. And when that SLR appeared, it was another Practica, not one of the MTL models this time, but the updated Practica loaded with electronic tech, including aperture priority auto exposure. It was the Practica BC1. Now, I do like aperture priority auto exposure. Aperture priority is my favorite mode to shoot in, and it's the mode that I pretty much leave my digital cameras on for pretty much all of the time, and that was a revelation. That was a wonderful way to shoot. It meant I could set an aperture, the camera selects the shutter speed, and I had full control over the image, almost as much control in fact as you get with shooting in manual, and that was my preferred way to shoot at the time, and it still is. So the Practica BC1, it was a second-hand purchase. I paid £50 for it, but it did come with 3 lenses. It came with a wide, a 28mm, a 50mm, and a longer 135mm. So I had the standard kit of lenses that every photographer in the 70s, 80s, and probably the 90s too considered was the basic requirement for any photographer worth their salt. The BC1 is a lovely little camera. It's very, very small. It's at least as small as this old Leica that I'm shooting today, and it might even be a little bit smaller. It really is a very small camera indeed. And I noticed that one of these lenses, 2 were okay, but one was absolutely beautiful, and it was the 50mm lens. That was a Practica lens, the Practica 50mm f1.8, and I was very, very surprised at how beautiful these images looked from the BC1. They really were fantastic images. And of course, the set of lenses, the kit of lenses, meant that I had the flexibility now to shoot any kind of image that I chose, more or less anyway. And so I had lots of fun with that camera, shooting, snapping away, probably wasting a lot of film in the process, but learning as I went, increasing, expanding my aesthetic understanding as I went. Sadly, that camera wasn't too reliable. I used it for around about a year, and then it developed a fault where it would very quickly eat up batteries in storage, and I don't know, it may have had a short somewhere. Something happened to it anyway, and it really wouldn't perform as I needed it to, and it finally conked out. So unfortunately, that was an unfortunate thing to happen, because it was a very lovely little camera, but it proved not to be particularly reliable in the final analysis. I even bought another one after that because I'd liked it so much, and they were very cheap by this time. I thought, well, perhaps that one just has a fault peculiar to that particular camera, but no. Gosh, what happened? Well, the same thing happened after a few months. It began to eat batteries. So that does seem to be a common fault in those old BC1s, and I'm not sure how many will have survived to the present day without that fault occurring. So by this time, it was around about 2005 or thereabouts, and it was becoming obvious that digital was becoming established as the new way to do photography. And although film was still around, very much still available, you could even still buy Kodachrome and get it developed in those days, even though it was still very much available, very much around, it became evident that it wasn't going to last for that much longer in the form that it had been, and that digital was the new way forward. So I bought a Nikon D80. That was a fantastic camera. It really liberated me. It was yet another tool that enabled my aesthetic abilities and my sense of what I wanted to do in photography to expand. Suddenly I could shoot as many images as I wanted, no problems about wasting film. I could snap away and get the shot right if it wasn't right first time. I could look immediately at what I'd shot, which was really helpful, and I could shoot in pretty much, well, almost any lighting conditions that I wanted to shoot in, because of course you could now turn up the ISO on the digital cameras. So that was a fantastic camera, and I did love the colours from that camera, far better than the colours from the Nikon D90 that I bought a year or two later on. Unfortunately, I'd sold the D80 by the time I realised that the colours of the D90 weren't that great, or at least not for my taste anyway. I know a lot of people love them. So, as soon as mirrorless came on the scene in around about, 2010, 2011, something like that, I bought a Panasonic GH2. Suddenly, a whole new world of photography was opened up to me in the shape of vintage lenses. Suddenly, I could use an old Helios lens, an old Jupiter lens, any old lens that you could imagine on this brand new piece of technology. And that's something that fascinates me. Is one of the things that fascinates me about mirrorless cameras is the fact that you can mix very old technology in the shape of old lenses with the very newest technology in the shape of new cameras. And I still find that fascinating today, which is why I use vintage lenses so much, or one of the reasons anyway. So the GH2 really enabled me to fly, to take wing, and to expand my aesthetic sensibilities and understanding using the looks that old lenses could make. And I had a load of fun using that GH2 until the advent of the Sony A7 full frame digital mirrorless camera, and that was a revelation. Suddenly I could use the old lenses as they'd been intended to be used, on the correct size of sensor that they'd intended to be used on. Of course, they were made for 35mm cameras. The A7 has a sensor the same size as a piece of 35mm film, so the old lenses perform exactly as the manufacturers intended them to perform, and you get everything, warts and all the faults, all the joys of each lens coming through onto the sensor, which it then records faithfully. And that camera too was a revelation. The A7 has been an absolutely fantastic camera for me, and I've used it and used it and used it. I've shot hundreds of vintage lenses on it, both cheap and expensive, both simple and not so simple. I've just shot as many lenses as you can think of on that camera, and it served me very, very well. And it's been absolutely fantastic for understanding what these vintage lenses can do, for understanding their aesthetic potential, their performance, and just generally gaining a very wide understanding of how they work and what they can do. And it's been absolutely brilliant for that. And of course I still use it today. I shoot vintage lenses on it for this channel all the time. Even though there are newer Sony cameras, or many newer Sony cameras now, I've stuck with that old A7 because it suits my purposes perfectly, and it's great for shooting those vintage lenses on. It was great when I got it, and it's still great now. However, after using it for some time, I became aware of some other cameras. I've shot lots of vintage cameras and digital cameras for the channel, and one of the cameras that I shot that I became aware of were the Fujifilm cameras, beginning with the X-T1, and I've shot several Fujifilm cameras. My own personal cameras that I've kept for my own use have been the X-T1, the X-T2 and the X-T3, of which I only currently have the X-T3. Now, the Fujifilm cameras were really fantastic. They have built-in film simulations, and they were absolutely fascinating to me for that reason. images from the Sony, from the A7, are nice, very good, no problem at all with them, but they didn't have that magic that the Fujifilm images have. I don't know of any image from any camera that's as nice as those Fujifilm images, even though they only have an APS-C sensor. They don't do a full frame model, they've stuck with APS-C. It's entirely adequate, and there is nothing like a Fujifilm camera for the colours that it can make, for the sharpness of images that it can make. And that camera has been the latest on my odyssey of cameras that increase my aesthetic understanding, cameras that allow me to increase and expand and enable my practice of photography. So that is a brief rundown of how I learned photography, and also of what I'm still learning in photography. Now, it seems to me that our photography and the kind of images that we can make are a function of the technology that's available. Certainly that's been my experience. The Fed 4 was a certain level of technology, enabled me to make certain kinds of images. The SLRs enabled me to make other kinds of images that the rangefinder, the Fed rangefinder, couldn't make. And mirrorless cameras, digital and mirrorless cameras, again enable me to make a different kind of technology and added to what those SLRs could do. So it really is a function of the technology. That's what dictates the kinds of images that we can make, and to a certain extent that dictates what we can do in photography and how our own personal aesthetic sense can be developed and encouraged by photography. And who knows what tech will come in the future, who knows what technological developments there will be that will further enable photography to do what it couldn't previously do. So I guess we're going to need to wait and see. So, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, I guess that's it from me for now. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I hope you've found it interesting and or useful in some way. Thank you very much for watching. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do chuck us a sub, that would be appreciated. Thank you to everybody for watching. Thank you to subscribers for your support, that's very much appreciated. And thank you to patrons for your support, that is very much appreciated too. Thank you to everybody who's watched and tuned in, who's given thanks, super thanks, or engaged with the channel in any way. It really is all very much appreciated. But as for me, I guess that's it for now. I'm going to get back home before the rain begins. It's looking a bit cloudy here, and the signs of spring that were previously in the air have disappeared. Well, I guess that's just the British weather. So thanks again, everybody, and if you're not doing anything too difficult, troublesome or annoying next week at around this time, please do check in for a spot more Zenography. Cheerio all.